Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the country you were born in no longer exists. Not conquered in a single dramatic battle, not burned in a single night, but slowly erased. Through laws, through forced relocations, through the careful destruction of everything that made your home feel like yours. The coins you used since childhood are now illegal. The language your grandfather spoke is being replaced by decree, and the name of your kingdom, a name that had survived for 600 years, is now forbidden. This is not a story about emperors or generals. This is a story about what it cost to build one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. And the cost was not paid in silver. It was paid in worlds. Before there was a China, there were kingdoms. Dozens of them, each one a living, breathing civilization, with its own alphabet, its own architecture, its own way of measuring time, its own gods, its own way of burying the dead. These were not tribes. They were not primitive villages. They were sophisticated states with bureaucracies, armies, philosophers, artists, and merchants who traded across hundreds of miles. People were born inside these worlds, raised inside them, died inside them, and they never once imagined that the world they knew would have to be destroyed so that something larger could take its place. What you are about to enter is that vanishing moment. The last generations who lived inside those kingdoms. The people who woke up one day still citizens of Chu, or Qi, or Han, and went to sleep subjects of something that had never existed before. Something called an empire. Let us begin where all stories begin, with ordinary life. Picture a market town somewhere in the state of Chu in the 3rd century before the Common Era. It is early morning. The fog is still sitting low over the river. A woman is arranging salted fish at a stall near the waterfront. She has been doing this since she was a child, watching her mother do it the same way. Across the street, a man in worn silk is arguing with a grain merchant about weights. Children are running between the legs of adults carrying water jars. An old scribe sits outside a small office, grinding ink for the day's paperwork, which will be written in a script that looks nothing like what is being used 200 miles north in the state of Wei. This is the detail that almost never makes it into the histories. In the period called the Warring States, roughly 475 to 221 before the Common Era, the kingdoms of ancient China did not share a common writing system. They shared ancestors. They shared a loose cultural heritage. They argued about the same classical texts. But when a merchant from Yan sat down to write a letter to a merchant in Chu, the characters on the page could look startlingly different. A contract signed in one kingdom might be completely unreadable to an official in another. This was not a minor inconvenience. It shaped the entire logic of commerce, diplomacy, and power. Money was the same problem. Each kingdom minted its own coins in its own shapes. The state of Chu produced flat bronze coins shaped like tiny spades. Qi used coins that looked like miniature knives. In some regions, bronze was cast into shapes that resembled cowrie shells, the ancient tokens of trade. To cross a border with money in your pocket was to carry something that might be useless on the other side. Merchants had to maintain mental conversion tables. Border towns became chaotic places where every transaction required negotiation, not just over price, but over the very medium of exchange. And yet, and this is the part that tends to get lost, people inside these kingdoms did not experience their world as chaotic. To the woman arranging fish at her Chu market stall, this was simply how the world worked. She spoke the Chu dialect. She used Chu coins. She measured cloth in Chu units. She paid taxes to a Chu official and prayed at a temple decorated in the distinctive turquoise and crimson style that had marked Chu sacred spaces for generations. The disorder that historians write about was not disorder to the people living inside it. It was home. The state of Chu alone had existed for nearly 8 centuries by the time of its destruction. 8 Centuries. To put that into perspective, 8 centuries before today would place us in the 13th century. Before the Renaissance, before the printing press, before most of the nations we now consider ancient. Chu was not a new experiment. It was a civilization so deeply established that its people could not fully imagine its absence. Chu had its own literary tradition. The poet Ku Yuan, who lived in this period, wrote verses that are still read today. Verses so soaked in Chu mythology, Chu landscapes, and Chu spiritual imagery that they feel like dispatches from another world entirely. When he writes about shamans and river spirits, and the particular way light falls on the marshes of the south, he is not writing universal poetry. He is writing Chu poetry. He is writing from inside a civilization that had its own relationship to the supernatural, its own cosmology, its own sense of beauty. This is what was at stake. Not just political borders, entire ways of imagining the world. Now travel north to the state of Xi. Different climate, different geography. The Yellow Sea is close. The air smells of salt. Xi was in many ways the intellectual capital of the Warring States period. Its rulers had established something extraordinary, a place called the Jixia Academy, located in the capital Linzi, which at its peak may have housed several hundred scholars simultaneously, drawn from across the known world. Confucians, Taoists, legalists, military strategists, astronomers, agriculturalists, all of them debating, writing, arguing in a city that was, by some estimates, one of the largest in the world at the time. Linzi was remarkable. Archaeological evidence suggests it may have had a population of several 100,000 people, served by a sophisticated water management system, organized into districts by profession, with neighborhoods of craftsmen clustered near neighborhoods of merchants, and administrative quarters separate from residential ones. Streets were laid out with intention. The palace complex sat at the heart of the city like a declaration of permanence. People who grew up in Linzi grew up believing in something. Not just in Qi as a political entity, but in Qi as a kind of civilization, a center of learning, a place where the best ideas gathered and competed. The scholars at Jixia were not merely advisors to the Qi court. They were, in a very real sense, the reason people came to the city at all. Merchants came to trade, but scholars came because Linzi was where the world's thinking happened. When that world ended, it did not end with a spectacular battle at the gates of Linzi. It ended with administration, with the replacement of Qi officials by Qin officials, with the gradual dissolution of the institutions that had made Linzi what it was. The Jixia Academy did not burn. It simply became unnecessary. One by one, its scholars dispersed, relocated, fell silent, or died. The conversation that had animated the city for generations simply stopped. To understand how all of this came to an end, you have to understand what made the state of Qin different. And the answer is strange, because for most of the Warring States period, Qin was not considered the most likely candidate for unification. It was a Western state, considered somewhat provincial, somewhat rough by the more refined Eastern kingdoms. Its culture was different, less literary, more military, more focused on agriculture and war than on philosophy and commerce. Eastern intellectuals sometimes looked down on Qin the way sophisticated city dwellers might look down on a frontier region. Capable, perhaps. Powerful, certainly, but not the center of civilization. What Qin had, in the end, was a system. And the system came from a man named Shang Yang, a minister who served the Qin court in the 4th century before the Common Era, and who rewrote the state so completely that it became almost unrecognizable. Shang Yang believed in one thing above all else. The power of the state must be absolute, and the citizens of the state must be fully organized in service of 2 goals: agriculture and war. Everything else was, in his framework, a distraction. Literature, music, philosophy, commerce. All of these things, Shang Yang argued, were weaknesses. They produced people who thought too much, who questioned too much, who had loyalties that competed with their loyalty to the state. His reforms were breathtaking in their thoroughness. He divided the population into groups of households that were collectively responsible for each other's behavior. If one family in your group broke the law and you did not report it, you shared their punishment. This was not a minor social innovation. It was a fundamental restructuring of how trust and loyalty functioned. In the older kingdoms, loyalty ran upward, to your lord, to your clan, to the traditions of your region. Under Shang Yang's system, loyalty ran sideways as well, binding neighbors into networks of mutual surveillance. Agricultural output was rewarded with status. Military success, measured in a grotesque but efficient way by the severed heads of enemies, was rewarded with rank and land. Merchants, by contrast, were viewed with suspicion and legally marginalized. The market logic that had animated the economies of Qi and Chu and the other kingdoms was deliberately suppressed in Qin in favor of state-directed production. And it worked. In a way that probably disturbed even those who designed it. It worked. Qin's armies became something qualitatively different from the armies of the other kingdoms. They were not just larger. They were more motivated, more consistent, more willing to endure hardship. When a Qin soldier killed an enemy in battle, he gained something tangible: rank, land, social mobility. The entire society had been engineered to make war the primary mechanism of advancement. The results were predictable and terrifying. The other kingdoms understood what was happening. They were not passive. For decades, the eastern states tried desperately to form alliances against Qin, a strategy called Hekong, the vertical alliance, which would unite the north-south axis of kingdoms against the western threat. The diplomat Zhang Yi, working for Qin, countered with a strategy called Lianheng, the horizontal alliance, which sought to peel individual kingdoms away from the coalition with promises of territory and survival. This diplomatic war was conducted with extraordinary sophistication. Ambassadors crossed borders carrying silk, gold, carefully worded letters. Rulers were flattered, threatened, bribed, deceived. The state of Han was the first to fall, in 230 before the Common Era. Then Zhao in 228, Wei in 225, Chu in 223, Yan in 222, and finally Qi in 221. The great intellectual capital, the city of the Jixia Academy, the kingdom that had believed most firmly in its own permanence. Each conquest was different in its character. The fall of Zhao was preceded by one of the most chilling events of the entire period. In 260 BCE, at the Battle of Changping, the Qin army defeated a Zhao force of somewhere between 400,000 and perhaps a smaller but still enormous number. Historical accounts vary and have likely been inflated, but something catastrophic happened here. The Zhao soldiers surrendered, and then, according to accounts that have horrified readers for 2,000 years, the Qin general Baiqi ordered them buried alive. Mass execution of prisoners of war on a scale that left Zhao permanently weakened, demographically crippled, unable to fully recover. Whether the number of dead was truly in the hundreds of thousands or something considerably smaller, the psychological impact was real. Word spread. Qin was not simply militarily superior. Qin was willing to do things that other states considered unthinkable. The fear this generated was itself a weapon. The fall of Chu was different, prolonged, painful, fought over years across the enormous territory of a kingdom that stretched from the Yangtze River Basin deep into what is now southern China. Chu had always been vast and difficult to govern centrally. Its nobility was proud and resistant. Its population was diverse, incorporating peoples from many different regional cultures. When Qin finally subdued Chu, it had to maintain a massive occupation force for years. The conquest was military, but the pacification was administrative, slow, and never entirely complete. And then it was over. In 221 before the Common Era, the king of Qin declared something new. He was not merely a king. He was the first emperor, Shi Huangdi, a title assembled from the words for the ancient mythological rulers of Chinese tradition. a title that announced not just political supremacy, but cosmological authority. He was not the king of Qin who had conquered other kingdoms. He was the ruler of everything under heaven. Now the real work began. And the real work was stranger and more difficult than the military campaigns, because the real work was making the idea of empire real in the lives of millions of ordinary people who had never asked for it. The first emperor and his chief minister Li Si, a man who had, like Shang Yang before him, a systematic and unyielding belief in the power of centralized control, launched a project of standardization so ambitious that it still shapes China today. Writing was unified. The complex and varied scripts of the different kingdoms were replaced by a single standard script, small seal script, which became the required form for official documents across the empire. Local variations did not disappear overnight, but they were pushed toward the margins. The written word, which had been a source of regional identity and distinctiveness, was now an instrument of unification. Weights and measures were standardized. The chaotic diversity of measurement systems, every kingdom had its own units of length, volume, and weight, was replaced by imperial standards. Officials carried bronze measuring tools issued by the central government. A merchant in what had been Chu now used the same measuring vessel as a merchant in what had been Yan, 1,500 miles to the north. Coinage was unified. The spade coins of some states, the knife coins of others, the various local currencies that had circulated for centuries, all of them were demonetized, replaced by a single imperial coin, a bronze round coin with a square hole in the center, a shape that would remain the dominant form of Chinese currency for the next 2,000 years. Imagine what this meant in practice. Your savings, denominated in the currency you had used your entire life, were suddenly not currency at all. You had to exchange them at whatever rate the new regime set, or find your wealth evaporated by administrative decree. Roads were built. This is the part that sounds like pure progress, and in some ways, it was. The Qin road network eventually stretched for tens of thousands of miles, radiating outward from the capital at Xianyang. But roads built by imperial command were built by conscripted labor. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary men, farmers, craftsmen, anyone who could be pressed into service, were pulled from their homes and sent to work on construction projects that might be hundreds of miles away. Many did not come back. Disease, exhaustion, accidents. The mortality rates on these massive projects were brutal by any standard. The Great Wall, which is really a series of walls, many of which predated Qin and were simply connected and extended, consumed enormous human lives. Stories circulated and were recorded of workers dying on the wall and being buried within it. Whether literally true or not, these stories captured something real about the experience of living through the construction of empire. You might be farming your fields one season and dead on a northern frontier the next. Not from battle, but from forced labor in service of a project you had no voice in and no stake in. The empire also moved people, deliberately, systematically. 600,000 aristocratic families, the nobility of the conquered kingdoms, were relocated to the Qin heartland, near the capital, where they could be watched. This was not subtle. This was the deliberate destruction of the social fabric of the old kingdoms. The aristocracy had been the repository of local culture, local memory, local authority. Remove them from their lands, sever them from their networks, and the kingdoms they represented became politically decapitated. New Qin administrators took their place, men loyal to the center, speaking the standard language, following the standard laws. The conquered territories also had their weapons confiscated. The first emperor ordered the collection of bronze weapons from across the empire, swords, spears, halberds, and had them melted down and cast into 12 enormous bronze statues that stood in the capital. The symbolism was transparent and intentional. The weapons that might have defended the old kingdoms had been transformed into decorative objects in the court of their conqueror. But perhaps nothing captures the anxious, controlling quality of early imperial rule more than the burning of the books. In 213 before the Common Era, Li Si proposed, and the first emperor approved, a decree ordering the burning of historical records, philosophical texts, and poetry from the former kingdoms. The specific targets were histories written by the conquered states, histories that maintained alternative narratives of legitimacy, that celebrated the rulers of Chu or Qi as the true inheritors of civilization. Also targeted were the texts of the Confucian scholars, who had been arguing for a style of governance grounded in tradition and moral example rather than in law and force. The practical effect was complex. Many books were hidden. Scholars memorized texts. Libraries in remote areas may have survived. The Qin Empire did not have the administrative capacity to enforce the decree in every village across the empire. And the decree lasted only a few years before the empire itself collapsed. But the intent was clear, and the symbolic weight was enormous. The old knowledge, the old stories, the old ways of organizing the world, they were dangerous. They kept alive the memory of what had existed before. One particularly chilling element. Scholars who maintained and discussed the forbidden texts were subject to severe punishment. According to accounts written after the fall of Qin, hundreds of scholars were executed, buried alive, in some tellings, in a grim echo of the soldiers of Changping. These stories, written by Confucian historians who hated the Qin regime, were certainly shaped by propaganda. The exact number is unknowable, but the suppression of intellectual life was real. People who made their living thinking, writing, and teaching found themselves in a state that viewed their profession with active hostility. Consider what daily life felt like in the early years of the empire for someone who had grown up in one of the conquered kingdoms. You wake up in the house you have always lived in the town you have always known. But the official who comes to collect your taxes now speaks with a strange accent and uses measuring tools you have never seen before. The temple down the road, which used to mark its celebrations according to the old Chu calendar, has been told to adopt imperial time. Your children are being taught to write in a script that looks subtly wrong to you, shaped by hands trained in the Qin tradition rather than the Chu one. The coins you earned this morning are the right coins, but the coins your grandfather left you are worthless unless you exchange them at the imperial office, which is only open on certain days, and where the officials are not always honest about the exchange rate. The books your family kept, not dangerous philosophical texts, just family records, genealogies, account books, are written in the old Chu script, and there is an anxious question now about whether keeping them is wise. You are not a rebel. You have no great political agenda. You simply want to feed your family and keep your farm. But the empire has reached into your life in ways that feel both invisible and inescapable. The language of your childhood is being quietly redefined as a dialect. The measurement system your grandfather taught you is now illegal for official transactions. The gods you pray to have not been abolished, but the new temple registrar wants to record their names in a different system. You are living through the disappearance of your world and you have no word for it, because the word China does not yet mean anything. You are a person who used to be from Chu, and now you are told you are from somewhere called the Qin Empire. The name of your home has changed and you did not vote for it, and you were not asked. The empire that promised order delivered it with a brutality that eventually made order seem worse than the old chaos. The legal code of Qin was based on legalist principles, clear, consistent, and harsh. Punishments were collective. If you were found guilty of a serious crime, your family could be punished with you. Sometimes 3 generations of a family were executed for the act of one member. This was not an occasional extreme measure. It was standard policy, calculated to deter crime by making every family member a stakeholder in every other member's behavior. The tax and labor demands of the early empire were crushing. The colossal construction projects, the walls, the roads, the enormous mausoleum being built for the first emperor himself, a project that would eventually employ hundreds of thousands of workers for decades, required constant human fuel. Peasant families could find themselves stripped of their male labor for years at a time. Fields went unplanted. Harvests failed. Families that had been self-sufficient became dependent. The resentment accumulated in silence because expressing it was dangerous. The first emperor died in 210 BCE while on a tour of the empire. He was 50 years old. His death was kept secret for weeks by his chief eunuch Zhao and Li Si, who feared the succession would not go smoothly. A fear that proved accurate. His chosen successor was maneuvered aside. A weaker son was placed on the throne. Li Si, the architect of empire, was eventually arrested on Zhao Gao's orders, subjected to the 5 punishments, and executed. The machinery of control that had been used to subjugate millions was turned on its own creators. Within 4 years of the first emperor's death, the empire was in open rebellion. And the rebellion came not from the old aristocracy. They had been relocated, disarmed, and marginalized. It came from the bottom, from peasants, from men who had been conscripted and were now late reporting for duty, facing the death penalty for a delay caused by bad weather, from men who had nothing left to lose. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, 2 conscripted laborers who mutinied rather than face punishment for a delayed arrival, launched a rebellion in 209 BCE that became the seed of the civil war that destroyed Qin. The Qin dynasty lasted 15 years, the most powerful military machine in the ancient world, which had spent more than a century building itself into an instrument of total conquest, collapsed in less than 2 decades of actual rule. What rose from the wreckage was the Han dynasty. And here, the story takes one of history's most interesting turns. The Han emperors looked at Qin and drew a very specific lesson. Not that empire was wrong. Empire was necessary. Empire was permanent. But that the Qin method of building empire had been catastrophically miscalibrated. The system had been too rigid, too demanding, too contemptuous of the traditions and loyalties that held society together. The early Han emperors relaxed the legalist framework. They reduced taxes. They released people from some of the labor obligations. They invited Confucian scholars back into government, giving the tradition of moral governance a place alongside, though always subordinate to, administrative power. They allowed a degree of cultural recovery. The texts that had been burned or hidden or memorized began to circulate again. But here is the thing that tends to get forgotten. The Han maintained the fundamental architecture of the Qin Empire. The unified script remained. The standardized weights and measures remained. The road system remained. The centralized administrative structure remained. What the Han changed was tone and burden, not basic structure. The empire continued. The kingdoms did not come back. Former aristocrats from the old states occasionally attempted to reassert claims, and the early Han rulers had to carefully manage this, granting some of them nominal authority in semi-autonomous kingdoms, while steadily reducing their real power over decades until those kingdoms too became fully integrated into the imperial system. It was a slow, patient dismantling conducted through politics rather than war. By the time the Emperor Wu came to power in 141 BCE, the last meaningful vestiges of the old kingdom's autonomy had been extinguished. The people who had grown up in Chu or Qi or Han or Zhao were gone. Their children had grown up in the empire. Their grandchildren had never known anything else. The process of forgetting was not dramatic. It was demographic, generational, inevitable. Each generation inherited less of the old identity and more of the new one. The curious thing is what survived. Language, in all its regional diversity, refused to die. What we now call Chinese dialects, the vast linguistic diversity that stretches from Cantonese in the south to the Shanghainese of the east to the many northern varieties, these are, in a very real sense, descendants of the old kingdoms. The official written language was unified. The spoken languages were not. They bent. They absorbed Qin influence. They incorporated new vocabulary, but they maintained their deep structures, their sounds, their rhythms. You can still hear, Faintly, across 2,000 years, the ghost of Chu in the languages of the South. Local religious traditions survived by absorbing and adapting. The shamanic practices that Qin Shi Huang described in his poems, the river spirits, the mountain gods, the elaborate ritual world of Chu, these did not disappear. They were incorporated into local practice, renamed, reframed, but still recognizable. The underlying spiritual landscape of the old kingdoms persisted in folk religion long after the political landscape had been erased. Even the food, the dietary traditions that distinguish Chinese regional cuisines today, the fiery peppers of Sichuan and Hunan, the sweetness of Jiangnan cooking, the saltiness of northern preserved foods. These regional identities have roots that go back further than unification, into the ecological and cultural histories of peoples who existed before they were called Chinese. The empire absorbed these survivals, incorporated them, allowed them to persist in private life while asserting total dominance in public life. The kingdoms were destroyed, but they were not, in every sense, erased. They went underground. They became unofficial. They became the texture of daily existence rather than the structure of political life. History remembers the first emperor. It remembers his terracotta army, those thousands of individual clay soldiers buried in precise military formation to guard his tomb. Each face supposedly unique, each figure representing an individual soldier. An act of reproduction so ambitious and so strange that it still does not quite make sense even when you stand in front of it. It remembers the scale of his ambition, the ruthlessness of his methods, the extraordinary brevity of his dynasty's survival. But history does not remember the woman arranging fish at the Chu market stall. It does not remember the scholar at the Jixia Academy who spent his life arguing about the nature of governance and died without knowing whether his ideas had mattered. It does not remember the Zhao soldier who survived Changping and walked home through a landscape of the newly dead to find his village smaller, quieter, permanently diminished. It does not remember the Qi merchant who woke up one morning and realized that the coins he had saved his entire life were no longer legal currency. These people are gone. Their names are gone. Their stories are gone. But the world they lived in, the world that was unmade so that something else could be made, that world left traces. In the languages spoken in provinces that still carry the old names, in the cooking styles and the folk festivals and the local deities that outlasted every administration that tried to replace them. In the literary tradition that Qin Shi Huang started, poems written in the voice of a man who understood, before anyone had words for it, that a civilization can vanish without making much noise. The kingdoms that ancient China had to destroy were not obstacles to civilization. They were civilizations. The cost of building one nation was the extinction of many worlds, and that cost was paid, quietly, invisibly, over generations, by people who only wanted to live in the world they had always known. They did not know they were living through history. They only knew that the world was changing, and that what was changing would not come back. And if this is what it cost to unite ancient China into a single empire, the languages erased by law, the coins melted down, the aristocracies relocated, the books burned, the soldiers buried, the scholars silenced, then the next question sits waiting in the darkness of history. What did that empire do with itself once it had finally won? What happened inside the walls of the first imperial palace in the decades after the last kingdom fell? Because what was built on those ruins was unlike anything the world had seen before, and it lasted for 2,000 years.